Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real treat actually, because it's a little bit different from my usual talks, but hopefully be really applicable to what's going on in the classrooms. I should also mention that I haven't been anywhere near a classroom for a very long time. I do give talks and I do give lectures to university groups and local history groups and wider groups, but so my sort of knowledge of what's happening in the history classroom at the minute is a little limited, but hopefully this is really applicable and you can see lots of avenues for looking at wider subjects of history through the avenue of the history of a house. I was going to start with quickly explaining what is a house historian. A lot of the time, and certainly more traditionally, this approach to the history of houses has largely been through architecture. And in a lot of cases, that's wonderful, and you gain a understanding of the development of architecture and changes through time. But what I specialize in is the social history within the history of a house. So it's the stories of the people. It's quite often the ordinary people that have come and gone in the history of a house, telling the story from when the house was built, and then all the different comings and goings, the different families, the different events, the different people. And it's that social history told through the avenue of a house. Obviously, the architecture is important, and that comes up. But my specialism is actually the social history, and it's where all the fun stories are, in my opinion. So hopefully you'll see that. One of the key things with looking at the history of a house is the breadth of sources, and I'm sure this is relevant for any historical research. But when it comes to the history of houses, there is a wide option of sources that I go to. And that also depends hugely on the age of the house. For example, a 1675 house is not going to involve the same sources and research as a house built in 1875. And equally, the location can have a big impact. Obviously, a house doesn't sit in isolation. It sits within a street, within a parish, within a town, and all those elements are important. But there are loads of different sources, and they each go into piecing together the history of a house. And these sources are important to gain the details of who's connected to the house, who was the owner, who were the occupants through different periods. But they also are important for guiding the actual research. So when you go into an archive, a lot of the sources available are guided by what parish a house is in, what ward, what district, and these change, and it's important to know, what parish was it in, but even counties boundaries change. And so actually you might find that one house, I've done a house that was in Worcestershire, now is in Gloucestershire, but archives were held in Birmingham. So actually understanding the wider picture of its context is important for actually finding what you need to find. One of the top tips, and this is quite important when looking at the history of a house, is to work backwards in time, almost like an archaeologist digging away at the different layers of history. And it's the same in this context. And one of the main reasons why is that the house name and number can change, the street name can change, but also prior to largely the 19th, 18th century, in some cases the 20th century, but actually earlier records, they often don't record an address at all. It's a house on a street, or it's John Smith's farm on the way to the manor. So actually you end up tracing the history of a house through the occupants and the owners rather than the address. So in order to spot where these things change, and to understand who was in the house at a specific time, you actually need to work backwards from something you're really certain of now, whether that's when the current owners bought the house, whether it's a record on land registry, and then you work backwards in time through different sources. And actually there's a number of examples where I found this, and you might think that a later house, well, surely it's had the same address for its whole life. But one of the key examples I found was in a house in West London, in Bedford Park in Chiswick. and it was built in the 1880s. But by the 1930s, so literally within 50 years, it had had 4 different addresses. And that involved the street name changing, the house number changing, then the street name changed again, and then so you just never know. So it's important to piece things together sort of backwards in time. One of the key things, and Sam mentioned this, is actually local history. And as I said, a house doesn't sit in isolation. It's very much a part of its street and its community and its parish and its ward. So it's actually really important to look at the local history. And as I said, this will guide you on finding the sources, but it also gives you a much bigger context to the history of a house. And that could be everything from providing clues as to why a house was built. Was it because the railways were built and actually there was a Victorian expansion of terraced houses, or was it a farming community? What was going on in order to provide clues as to when and why a house was built? And also in the bigger picture, and again this will provide clues as to where to go for sources, but was it part of a manor or a landed estate? What was the local industry? Was it fishing? Was it mining? Was it agriculture? Was it a market town? What was going on? And equally, what changes over time would have had an impact on the history? So that could be everything from, as I say, the railways going through, or the canals, the Industrial Revolution. Maybe it was a small village and then it massively expanded because of the industrial impact during the 18th or 19th century. And then equally, was there an economic downturn? Was it a thriving farming community, but actually it was drastically affected by an economic downturn and it shrunk, and that had an impact on the house. And then later, perhaps it was part of a post-World War I development and homes for heroes, or was it a garden city and actually the houses were built off a sort of mid-20th century development. So there's all sorts of things that can impact the history of a house in the context of its local history. Yes, as I say, this will provide clues, hints and tips as to where to go, and will also guide the bigger picture of the history of a house. And there's looking at all sorts of things in the bigger picture of historic events, and one of my sort of bugbears, I guess, is that I actually really like to look at what was going on with ordinary people at specific times in history, and that's revealed very clearly in the history of a house. But when you're looking at broader subjects, whether that's maybe even the Civil War, and actually you've got a farming community or farmhouse in Gloucestershire, how was it affected during the Civil War and there were battles going on nearby, but actually it had its land and animals confiscated? Or was it a Victorian development and the railways came through, but was that a good thing? Were the people able to grab onto new markets and actually get their goods to larger towns? Or actually was it detrimental, and actually they were really affected by a lack of housing, and slum housing was knocked down, and actually there was a problem with providing housing? So there's all sorts of bigger picture things that can come into understanding the local history and the house within that. And when you're looking for these histories or these details of local history, obviously everywhere will be different. So whether it's a parish or town, county, the first place to go is the Victoria County History Series. They've been going for over 100 years, often colloquially known as the Red Books. And they're slightly different in different areas. So some were actually written 180 years ago. So actually they're probably not going to have as much detail as one that was written 10 years ago. But alongside that, there's the county, you can get broader county histories. Local history groups have different sources available. Some of these are online. That's pamphlets and books and different studies. You've got building group studies as well, which can be really useful. The Survey of London, if you're in London. So there's a wide spectrum. So even just looking at a general overview, that's sort of where I would go first. Probably getting down to specific sources. Maps is a great one, and I would always start with maps. So there's a whole range of different maps available. The first one I've listed there, the Ordnance Survey maps, they were produced obviously from as military maps much earlier, but in terms of detail to provide specific houses and streets and location, the 25-inch maps were produced roughly around the 1860s, but in some areas that might have only been in the 1870s or 80s. It took them a while to do the whole country, but roughly from the 1860s. And then they were periodically updated. So say from the 1860s, you then get the 1880s, the 1900s, 1910, 1930s. So you can actually sort of track the development, not only of a house, but the street and the whole parish or the whole town or the whole village over a period of time. And so that's really wonderful for showing development. And you might find that in the 1860s, the house you're researching isn't there yet. And then of course it appears in the 1890s. So you've got a sort of a very clear idea that it must have been sort of that 1870s or 80s period that the house was built, and that gives you clues as to where to go. The Ordnance Survey maps are largely available online. Some are not, it depends on your area, but most of them are available. National Library of Scotland, I've listed there. Obviously it's the whole of the UK, not just Scotland. And also oldmaps.co.uk. They're both Ordnance Survey maps. So they're a place you can go online, really easy to look at. On top of that, there's a whole range of different parish, town and county maps that will be relevant for each area, and they vary just widely depending on where you are. But there are some other online options, and I'm sure they're getting better. Each sort of county record office or each area, they're getting better at actually providing digital sources online. So you might find that there is actually one in your local area. But I've mentioned two here, the Layers of London, which is brilliant, and it literally has a whole range of different maps, everything from the Romans through to now. And they're really wonderful because it literally is the layers of maps over London. Know Your Place southwest. So actually this covers places like Gloucestershire, Somerset, Wiltshire, and they're also got a range of different maps which are wonderful. So yeah, there's a whole selection. Now I'm just showing you this example because it's one of my favorites. It's Kensington in London, obviously, and it shows the parish of Kensington, 1852. Not sure if you can, let me see if I can get this to work, the highlighter. So here you've got High Street, Kensington, you've got South Kensington down here, you've got Earl's Court there. But within, let me just get this, 25 years, that happens. And it's just such a visual illustration of Victorian development. And I just find it fascinating because literally those fields and open meadows and you had market gardens have all been pretty much completely covered. There's a few gaps, but you've got the underground's been built and you've got massive development. So that's just one example of how maps can be really helpful in visualizing what's going on in an area. Just to carry on, there's a whole range of different maps, and these will be relevant perhaps depending on what subject you're looking at, or obviously when I'm researching the history of a house, it depends on its history. You know, was it affected by this bombing in the Second World War, or was it was it in an area where there was an outbreak of pandemic? You've got disease maps I've put there very generally, but they were produced in different areas for different reasons, and some areas don't have them at all. But you know, looking at say the cholera outbreaks or typhoid, and they produce maps to sort of actually get a handle, much like we do now with the current pandemic, to get a handle on where the disease is spreading and why. As I said, there's Charles Booth's poverty map, which was London, and that was produced in the 1890s and 1900s, and it was a map of London by socioeconomic conditions. So that's everywhere from poor, the description by Charles Booth is semi-criminal, which is hardly complimentary, but that's in black. and then it's color coded through the different sort of socio-economic groups through to gold, which is the most wealthy. But they offer a really, really useful visual history of what was going on at that time. So actually, if you're looking at the history of London, that's really great. The fire insurance maps are largely towns, but they range all over the country. You can view quite a few of those on British Library website, so head there, or they're available in local archives. Bomb damage maps, disease maps, and estate and manorial maps, and these will also be hit and miss just depending on where you are and whether an estate or a manor undertook to have a survey and produced a map. So there, yeah, lots of different options depending on where you are. One of the key sources for House Histories is the Tithe Map. And this is really valuable, not only because it's a visual representation, but it has an apportionment to go alongside it, which provides really vital clues. They tended to be produced late 1830s into the 1840s, sometimes a little later, depending on the area. But they were essentially produced when tithe payment was changing from a goods or payment, so they're literally handing over crops and animals, to a monetary payment. And in order to work out what tax that was going to be, what tithe was going to be due, they did a survey. So the top here, you can see this is a house in Essex. The house itself is numbered with a representation of the house and then the farm buildings around it. And then each field is numbered. And then below, you've got the record of the apportionment, which gives you the name of the owner of the land, the occupant, and then the corresponding numbers for each field, and then a description. Literally gives you what was going on the land. Was it arable? Was it meadow? And then a description of the size, and then its value. And then that was calculated to work out what tithe was due. So this is really valuable because it names the owner and the occupant for a start, but it also gives you a big picture of what was going on at the time. And these can still be really useful if you've got a house that was only built later, because you can look at the land before the house was built. So yeah, really, and it matches in really nicely with the 1841 census. So for house histories, it's a pivotal kind of tool that we use. Alongside that, there's also the enclosure maps and awards, and these were not produced everywhere. Again, it does depend on the area, and they were largely late 18th century, but some were earlier, some were later, just depending on what was going on in that parish, that area. And some were private acts, enclosure acts, and so a landowner might have decided to actually go about enclosing his land much earlier, and actually it's a different kind of picture. But then there were government acts that were brought in largely, as I say, late 18th century. And in essence, it was a real shift in the way of land management that had been in place for hundreds of years, from the medieval sort of strip farming. And you can kind of see here, there's different long lines of land. Some of it's already larger blocks, but it was largely enclosing those into larger portions of land, and then distributing the ownership of those different lands fairly amongst the landowners. So, you know, if you had a hilly plot of land, or if you had one that was by the river, or one that was rocky ground, so you had to they had to work out, you know, the corresponding value of land. But a key element was the enclosure of common lands, which had been in place for generations, for centuries. And this had an impact on the local poor mostly, because they had the right to graze or forage on common land, but then they lost that right when it came to enclosure. So there's a bigger picture about how the whole shape of the country changed in terms of land management and ownership. And so actually, when you're looking at a big picture of perhaps how things changed from medieval times or Tudor times through to the 18th century or the 19th century, and how did that shift so dramatically, and what impact did that have on different people and different communities. So moving on, as I say, I specialise in the social history of houses. So one of the key sources is the census. And you might be familiar with this. You've probably seen it on programs like Who Do You Think You Are and that sort of thing. But it's a really valuable tool for house histories as well. And in essence, obviously this is actually quite apt because we've all just completed our 2021 census. But for a historical source, it's also valuable because it does list everyone in the house on census night. And the key with that is that so many other records, you only get the landowner or you only get the head of the house. So this is really valuable for showing everyone. So that's, you know, husbands and wives, children, visitors, lodgers, boarders, you know, everywhere, servants. So yeah, so it's really valuable. The first census was actually taken in 1801, but the first one to produce personal information and provide names was 1841. The most recent census available is in 1911. The 1921 census is due next year. So there's a lot of people waiting with bated breath for that release. But yes, so as you can see here, this is actually a street. It's listed as King Street. It later became Kingly Street. So if anyone hangs around Carnaby Street on a regular basis, this is a street parallel to Carnaby Street. So right in the middle of town, between Regent Street and Carnaby Street. And it's a really great illustration of the different housing conditions and how people were living. So as you see, there's a lot of people, and you can see with the house numbers down the side on the left, you've got several households in one house. So each house is divided up into separate living accommodation. And from 1891, as this one is, it started to actually include the number of rooms that were occupied. So let me just try this again. So you can see here down this column, it's giving you the number of rooms occupied. So that's 2, 1, you've got 3 people living in one room, there's another couple living in one room. So there's 3 rooms, 1 room. So it really shows you this is a small Georgian terrace, as it turns out, but each floor has been divided up and you've got families living in multiple rooms. So it's a really vivid picture of what was going on and how people were living. And then alongside, obviously, you've got their marital status, you've got their age, you've got their occupation. And in this case, there's loads of tailors and tailoresses. There's a few slightly different occupations, but you can really get a glimpse also. So that street was very dominated by tailoring. So that again gives you another picture of what was going on, not only in a house, but in the street and the surrounding area. And this gives you where they were born on the right. So if you're delving further into the history of a particular family within a house, you've got clues as to where they came from and different things. So as well as that also offers an opportunity to look at people moving about. So you can see this Sweden, you've got London, you've got Warwickshire, you've got Devon, you've got Hull, you've got Ireland. So again, that gives you a picture about where people are coming from. Okay, now just to contrast, this is quite a nice illustration. This is 19 Curzon Street. This is the former home of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli. And you can see, oh, you probably see with my arrow here, what is really interesting is he is living there on his own. Then he has 13 live-in servants. So it's one large house packed with servants, and he's the only one. And as you can see also, there's a note here, died 19th of April, 1881, RIP. So that was about a month after the census was completed. So the census enumerators have added a note that actually he has since died since the census was first taken. But again, it gives you a really clear indication of the different living conditions, from a packed sort of multi-divided house in Soho through to Mayfair, where you've got the former Prime Minister, who's the only occupant, but actually technically he's not the only occupant. He's got 13 living servants alongside. So yeah, another great picture of what's going on. Further occupational sources, and when I say occupational, I mean who's occupying a house, and they are the directories. We sort of tend to use the general term directories, but they're known by quite a few different names. So I've listed some there. You've got trade directories or street directories, and that's largely because they started as a list of tradespeople. The earlier ones were actually recording where was your local blacksmith, or what was the details of the vicar, or although that's probably more obvious, but you know, it was literally a list of tradespeople and other key community people, and then it slowly developed, and then you get street directories, which are obviously listed by street in larger towns. It's also called the post office or Kelly's directory, and that's because the publisher was Kelly's, so it's colloquially known as Kelly's directories. But you also get local directories. So the ones I've shown here, this is a specific local directory for South Ascot. And you can sort of see, actually, it's got a list of all the nobility and gentry, all the private residents. And then it's got a few tradespeople, and it's got a few key details about the services in the area. But it's actually, what is key with this is it's not everyone. And a lot of the earlier directories, they don't actually list every single person living in that area. They slowly started to, but the other thing with directories is they're a commercial publication, so they weren't an official document, official record of people. So that also means you can find errors. Sometimes there's been multiple occasions where I know someone's died because I've got their death record, but they're still recorded in the directory the following year because the directory just published what they had the year before. So there's things like that can pop up. But also on the right here, you see this is a small village in South Gloucestershire, and it actually gives you a little potted history of that village. So they're all really useful for that as well. So it gives you a few details about the village, its parameters, its details, who was the lord of the manor, who were the most prominent or large landowners in the area. And then again, it lists the main people. So you've got the vicar, and a gentleman resident, and then most people are commercial providers, they're farmers and blacksmiths and butchers and whatnot. But it's really useful to have this alongside other records. And that's the thing with a lot of these, as I said at the beginning, there's a range of different sources, and they all kind of come together, and actually you'll use the directories alongside the census and alongside other records. And one of those other records are electoral registers. Obviously, one of the key things with an electoral register is that it's based on your eligibility to vote, and this raises big questions, and actually can be addressed in the classroom about universal suffrage, about democracy, about people's eligibility to vote. So prior to 1928, there was a property ownership requirement for women, and actually before 1918 for men. And actually so the earlier you go back, the fewer people who are eligible to vote. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Having said that, it's still generally quite a good source, but the earlier 19th century ones, you have to read between the lines and understand what's going on with who's eligible to vote. But largely for the 20th century, you've got most people who were eligible to vote, who were living in the house, are recorded. There are a few gaps, so things like they weren't completed during both world wars. The earlier records are by people's names and not street. But in essence, as I say, if you're using this alongside a directory and the census and other records, then it's another valuable tool. Yeah, and actually one of the key things, again, if you're looking at broader historic subjects, obviously the suffragettes is a huge one. That's a really obvious look at that subject around the early 1900s. And again, if you're looking at a census record, I've done houses where there was actually a woman and her daughters who had written across the 1911 census, you know, not real people, we don't have the vote, and they refused to send, you know, to complete the census. And then if you look at that with perhaps later electoral registers, and you see those women who gain the vote, so you know it's actually a big picture. You can gain lots of details. Also looking at things like the Reform Act in 1832, and obviously how that changed people's ability to vote. And but then of course the Chartists and how they fought to have the vote for every man, not but then wider subjects like Peterloo in 1819 in Manchester. So again, you're looking at big picture. Even though you might be researching one house in one street in one town, it gives you a bigger picture about what was going on at the time. Another key source are tax records. This always makes me laugh because no one likes to talk about tax, but actually the records they leave behind are really actually very helpful for researching the history of the house. And that's largely because most of the early taxes were based on the value of a house. So I've listed there the parish rate books. These are essentially like early council tax. And they vary. You can get different types. So you can get a watching rate, which is basically security before we had police. Then there's sewerage, highway, church, everything you think about that goes into actually current council tax began as a sort of separate rate or a separate tax. But the most common is the poor rate. And actually when you're researching in archives, this is often the most common one that's survived and you can look at in records. And this was the value of a property, a certain amount based on that value to go towards the poor relief. And then this brings up bigger questions about poor relief and actually how, you know, the workhouse in the 19th century or prior to the benefit system that we have now, how were people supported? And then even earlier, you go back to poor relief or poor houses before the sort of workhouses that have got, you know, the terrible reputation of the 19th century. But then even going back before that, looking at actually the dissolution of the monasteries, because obviously prior to then, the church was largely looking after the poor and the sick, providing shelter. And then, of course, the dissolution of the monasteries came in. And what did that mean for the support of poor and the sick in the community? So that was then when you got the first relief taxes coming in. And actually, there's a whole, you know, you could do a whole thing on that alone. So there's lots of bigger questions. Yes, then I've listed land tax. And again, what's really interesting about land tax, again, it's another tax based on the value of the land. But prior to most of the records that survive from the 18th century, late 18th century to about 1832. And the main reason for this is that actually prior to that, the land tax record was used as proof of eligibility to vote, because it was used as proof of property ownership in order to vote. So along came 1832, the Reform Act, and these records were no longer needed because they changed the register of electoral vote. So that's interesting in and of itself. Some areas you can actually get land tax going right the way back, and actually the history of the house in Bristol that we did for the third series of A House Through Time, it had land tax records going back to the 17th century, which was incredible, fantastic source for Bristol. But what was key with that was that was where we found the first owner, the first man who built the house, and his story of how he gained his wealth from the slave trade. And so that opened up that whole picture about, yes, the street of houses, he actually built a few houses in that street. But it was off the wealth he gained from the slave trade. So, and that was largely from land tax that we got those big clues as to who he was and what was going on. So yeah, there's all sorts you can find. Another key tax record, this goes by a few different names: Inland Revenue Valuation Survey or the 1910 Valuation Survey. It's often sometimes called Doomsday, but in essence, it was a record produced for a new tax that was being introduced by David Lloyd George. In the end, it actually didn't come into fruition, but we still have the results of the survey, which is great for us. You know, in terms of a source, it's amazing, it's brilliant. It was taken between around 1910, 1915. And in essence, it was, again, another valuation of property in order to raise a tax. And this is showing a map of a street in Highbury in North London. And you can see that each house is given a number, and then that number was corresponded with a field book. These records are in the National Archives, so when we get back to the National Archives, you can look there. But the brilliant thing was that in the field book, you had loads of detail. You had the owner and the occupant of the house. In some cases, you had the type of ownership, whether it was freehold or leasehold or copyhold, when the last sale took place, when the last rental agreement was made. Then, of course, you have the value in order to work out what tax was due. But then alongside that, you have a description of the property, which can be a bit hit and miss. Sometimes they can be brilliant. They can literally give you floor by floor description of each of the rooms in the house, lots of detail. I did a house, actually, one of the oldest houses I've researched, which was 15th century down in Devon. And the description was very old house. So not perhaps as helpful as some. But alongside that, you can sometimes get plans. You know, I did a really tricky house in Kent where actually it had been divided up and the back was different to the front and things. But actually it gave a plan in the field book, so which was amazing. So yeah, lots of different details. There are other tax records, and quite often we get asked, or I get asked, about things like window tax. That was brought in 1696. The problem with these records, the window tax and also hearth tax, is that they didn't provide personal information. So often it is literally a number and listed quite often just next to someone's name, or there's very little detail to specify a property in a house. So in a lot of cases, you actually need to already know the name of the person you're looking for, and then you can at least gain perhaps details about how many hearths it had and how big the house was. But it's not as useful as some. But having said that, say for the hearth tax, it was brought in 1662, largely to provide an income for Charles II after the Restoration. So I find this really interesting, and it opens up questions about the restoration of the monarchy and you know the change from the Commonwealth and Oliver Cromwell and the Commonwealth, and then through to the Restoration. So there's all those big pictures about what was going on, and actually annoyingly the everyday person was having to pay a new tax just for the king to come back. So you know that raises those questions. Window tax was in place for a lot longer. As I said, it started 1696. It wasn't repealed until 1851. So 150 odd years of this window tax, and it was largely on larger houses. So then basically the more windows you had, the more tax you paid. But then you've got this bigger picture of what that meant for the survival, or the built history, I guess is probably the best way of looking at it. And that's where you get things like bricking up windows, because people didn't want to pay as much tax, so they reduced the number of windows. It should also be added, there's a bit of a caveat to that a lot of bricked up windows weren't bricked up for the window tax. It's sometimes a bit of a misnomer that, but a lot of them were. But then equally after 1851, after it changed, actually you get a change in the architecture, and you've got much bigger windows. You get bay windows, you get stained glass windows, you get the sort of late 19th century arts and crafts design, and suddenly windows have become a much bigger feature because you're not paying tax on them anymore, as well as the changes in architectural attitude. But it's an interesting point that it's, you know, it started to shift after the window tax was repealed. So when we get to this point, this is where actually you end up at the whole, again, loads of different sources, and in these cases, not all of them will be available for each house you research. So it just depends on what survives and the history of that specific house as to whether it, and the people connected to the house, as to whether these sources will be useful or whether they're still around. So wills and probate is a key one. Probate inventories can be useful, but it does depend on the size of the house, and again, who's left the will or the probate that's in place for that. Often it's a larger house in those cases, but you can still, for example, insurance records I've listed. I've done really little workmen's cottages, one in Warwickshire I'm thinking of, which is a row of cottages. There were 3, but they were owned by the same man, and he was insuring them all. The houses themselves were small and occupied by labourers and working people, but actually the insurance record still survives because it was one owner who was insuring his property. So a lot of people assume that you have to have a larger house. So it doesn't always work that way. And photos and illustrations is another key one. Obviously, this is one of my favorite photos. This is taken of a house in Gloucestershire. This was the one that used to be in Worcestershire, it's now in Gloucestershire. It was taken from a sales particular, and it's lovely because it's actually got the former owner standing there with his dog on the front lawn there. So it's just a really lovely picture, and actually you've got a picture of a former owner of the house, which is nice. As I said, sales particulars are another source, and these can vary again. So it depends on the house, and sometimes you get sales particulars for the furniture inside the house and not the house. So it just depends. But they can be really great for providing lots of extra detail. Primarily a description. So you've got, as you've seen here, this is a house in another one in Lechlade in Gloucestershire. It's got a layout of the rooms, it's got details of the owner. Sometimes you get plans, sometimes you get maps, sometimes you get details of if the house is occupied by someone else. It gives you the tenancy agreements and actually the date of when that tenancy was signed and how much they're paying per week or whatever it is. And the same with auction catalogues. Just depends on obviously how the house was sold. But then moving on, you've got things like military records, and all these will vary, just as I say, depending on who's connected to a house, and court records. There's so many different stories, but I'm just thinking for military records, for example, I researched a house in Oxfordshire, where it turns out the former owner had been a prisoner of war in Italy. But this incredible story unraveled, and the records are still in the National Archives, where he actually escaped through Switzerland. And there's a record of when he got back to England, he's recorded as obviously telling his story and how he escaped by gunfire from the Italians, and extraordinary, amazing stories. And then he returned to his house in Oxfordshire and actually renovated it and did it up and made it much larger. So it was actually part of his story about his house, because he'd had this extraordinary circumstance of being a prisoner of war in Italy. So you just never know. There's all sorts of things that you can unravel and discover. Yeah, more personal histories. Again, this is where you start merging into sort of genealogical research. So once you've got the details of names and dates with the history of a house, you then start delving into who people were, what were their stories. And you've got letters and diaries. This shows some letters for a house in, actually this is the one with the dog out the front, but these were later record in the 19th century. And as it turns out, these are letters from a father to son, and actually it turns out the son had pretty much wasted all his money. He'd had gambling debts, and he was writing to his father for help because he needed to pay his debts. And in the end, I think his father did help him, but he was disinherited because his father helped him with all this money before he died. And then the son actually immigrated to South Africa. So this whole story unraveled about, life in the house and the fact that the son was disinherited. And it was all through these surviving letters, which was incredible. So these are still in the archives. And then you've got parish registers and civil registration, obviously telling you details about births, marriages and deaths, burials. And of course that can fit. If you've got generations of a family in the house, then that can be really important, and also revealing about who they were and what was going on, who they married, how many kids did they have, all that sort of stuff. Another really valuable source are newspapers, and these can be helpful for such a range of details. And it's actually great because we're increasingly getting a myriad of newspaper sources digitally available. So there's the British Newspaper Archive collection. There's also the Times, the Guardian, Sunday Times, Observer, just trying to think, pretty much, you know, and they've got different archive collections you can search. And it's everything from an advertisement for the house. So this shows you a farm in Hampshire, gives you a picture of the house, it gives you a bit of a description, it gives you the dates, sometimes it gives you the name of the person selling the house. And then again below, you've got another advertisement for a house in near Cheltenham in Gloucestershire. Again, it gives you a brief description, gives you a few details. But then you've got more personal stories. So the one that's pictured there on the right is actually, it's quite shocking, this is in the newspaper, but it turns out basically a man ran off with another woman and left his wife in the house. It's extraordinary that it's reported, but as you see there, you know, you won't see me again. It's this whole thing about he ran off with another woman. And what was interesting in that story is that in the Electoral Register, I did find that it changed from John, and then the wife name changed, or the woman in the house changed, and I couldn't work out what was going on. And then I found this, like, oh my gosh, he left his other wife and then went off with another woman, and then she moved into the house, and so all sorts going on. And you can often find those stories in newspapers. There's also, you know, I've found stories of events. You've got break-ins, you've got court records, there's a house in Mayfair which was being run as an illegal gambling den, and there was a big raid on one particular night in the 1840s, and it's, you know, all in the newspapers. But then actually in the same street in Mayfair, there was a story about a monkey in the 18th century who escaped from his owner and ran rampant down the street. And so you just never know what you'll find. So newspapers can be wonderful. So they provide details like announcements for engagements and weddings, also things like advertisements for staff. So the, you know, woman of the house is advertising for a new lady's maid, that sort of thing. So a whole range of things. But what's interesting with newspapers is that it could raise lots of questions about how things are reported. And if you're covering this in the classroom, perhaps you're looking at what, you know, maybe bias in the media, and what, you know, what one newspaper says versus another newspaper, and how the media argument can hold different opinions. And you've got all sorts of questions coming up. Things like the early printed press and literacy. So and how actually literacy in Great Britain was actually fairly good compared to some countries. And then you have this huge printing press, sort of 17th into 18th century. You've got so many different types of newspapers. So it can raise all sorts of other questions as well, which is, yeah, really valuable for looking at the history. Yeah, moving on to records that are really valuable for the Second World War, and particularly obviously for the home front. I think a lot of the times we look at the Second World War and we're looking at the battles, and we're looking at D-Day and Dunkirk, and which are really important and very valuable to understand what was going on. But what was going on at home? What were people doing in their homes in the Second World War? And there's a few different sources that can be really valuable for this. The first is the 1939 Register. This was released a few years ago. It's like a census, but it doesn't have quite as many details. But what's really valuable is it was taken September 1939, so the first month of the Second World War. And it was largely to provide details for ration books and ID cards. And there are some nuances to it. So not everyone was recorded if people were already serving in the military, that sort of thing. But on the whole, you've got a really valuable source, especially thinking that the 1931 census was destroyed during the war, and then the 1941 census wasn't taken because of the war. So actually without this, there's a big gap in the middle of the 20th century. but alongside, obviously, you've got names, you've got birthdays, you've got their marital status, and you've got their occupation. But I use this example because it's actually from a hotel, sort of a large lodging house in Putney in southwest London. But you can see down the far right-hand column, it also gives you their war service. And I find this just fascinating. And it's just such a valuable glimpse as to what was going on. So if you think, actually, you know, you've got a retired woman, or you've got a hotel manager in that case, or you've got different, perhaps ordinary jobs, but then you find out that they're a volunteer ambulance driver, or they're a volunteer auxiliary fire service, or they're volunteer police force or constabulary. So there's all sorts of details, and it's just such a wonderful snapshot. And if you put that into the bigger picture of a house and what's going on and the occupants, and you find that actually there might have just been a housewife or domestic duties, as it's often recorded here, but actually they're an air raid warden, or they're, you know, volunteer nurse, or there's all sorts of different things. So really valuable source. And also the 1939 register was used later, and it was kept and actually used as the foundation to provide names for the NHS in 1948. So again, is another pivotal moment in 20th century history and our current history about the beginnings of the National Health Service. And alongside that, you can't see it in this example here, but in a lot of other cases, women, because the record was kept by the NHS, was actually updated over time through the late 20th century, you often get women and their name is crossed out and their married name is added over the top, which is another really valuable source if you're looking at who's who and what was going on. And you can find out that sort of Mary Jones married and became Mary Smith or whatever it was. But it's another valuable bit of information you can get. So yeah, so that's a fabulous source. And this one is a little less known. It's perhaps not the greatest image, but the National Farm Survey was taken between 1941 and 1943. And it was essentially taken, it was a survey of farms right in the middle of the, you know, the worst of the sort of food crisis in the middle of the Second World War. And it was to look at the efficiency and the standards of farms when food was massively in need. So it surveyed everything from how many animals did they have, what kind of animals did they have, what crops were being grown, how efficient they were, whether they had running water, whether they were still using a well, whether they had electricity or they were still using gas lights, how many farmers and how many workers were on the, so it's an amazing snapshot. And of course it gives you the name of who's occupying the farm and if it was their farm or if it was owned by someone else. But it's a wonderful tool. So again, looking at the bigger picture of what was going on the home front during the Second World War, it's a really valuable tool, and especially for rural locations where we often look at perhaps the urban environment and how the Blitz or bombing affected different towns and cities, but how were things in rural locations in different places. So really valuable tool. And as I've listed there, you've got bomb damage maps and records, air raid warden reports. Some different towns and counties and different areas, different cities will have different kind of reports. Some have bomb damage maps, some don't have anything, but some have perhaps records of provision of housing from people who have been bombed out. So different sort of municipal records can be really helpful. I actually did a house again in London, but in this case it was extraordinary. It was actually a women's shelter, and before the bombing hit, it was actually being used largely by secretaries who were all working in Whitehall, who were all working for government departments during the war. And then there was someone had written a diary experience of bombing, and then the fact that they had to provide emergency accommodation, and you had all sorts of stories. And then she actually, in this record, the woman explains a night when a V1 bomb hit just near the shelter, near the hostel. So extraordinary records that can give you a really valuable glimpse of what was going on and how people experienced the Blitz or different times during the Second World War. So moving on, this is looking back at sort of older documents, I think when you're looking at the history of a house, deeds are actually really valuable for current houses, but at the same time, it's a bit hit and miss, largely because from 1970, you no longer needed to provide all the historic deeds in order to sort of show ownership of provenance of a property. So you tended to start losing a lot of old documents, which is a bit heartbreaking for someone in my position. But you can still find records, and they become really valuable for earlier history, if you're going back, if you've got an older house. And that's largely because a lot of the records I've mentioned so far, they tend to be 18th and 19th century and then into the 20th century. But prior to that, there's far fewer documents, and so the deeds and historic records become invaluable. And they're essentially the legal documents for a house. So that actually, under the umbrella term of deeds, you get leases and mortgages, you get disputes, you get marriage agreements, particularly when before the Marriage Act, and actually property would pass to a husband from a woman, you know, if she inherited a house from her family, then it would go to the husband, that sort of thing. So there's also abstracts and conveyances is another one, rental agreements. So there's a whole variety. And this just shows you an example, and I always show this one because this is actually very normal for a historic deed when you go looking in archives. But obviously, if you compare that to sort of a land registry title register, which is often like a page long, like typed out information, this just has so much more information. It gives you a lot of legal speak. Of course, there's a lot of that, but also it provides details like, you know, the person buying the property was the son of such and such, or the husband or wife of such and such, or actually the house had passed between this person and that person. So you can get loads of other information, and it gives you a description of the property sometimes, and details that just quite often are lost in land registry records. And this is also a wonderful example because it's a marriage agreement, as I mentioned, so 1764. But because the property was being passed due to a marriage coming up, it was giving you the provenance of that land and property in order for it to be fairly transferred to the new husband. So it actually gave you the history way back, and actually I was able to trace it back to the 1690s, and then through further records back to the 1580s, which is extraordinary. And actually it provided loads of detail, not only about the ownership, but who the occupant was. And so it's, yeah, in terms of piecing together the history of a house, this is gold. So yeah, it's a really nice example. Alongside that, you get manorial and estate collections, and they can encompass lots of different things. Obviously, with a manor, you've got a different kind of record with land ownership part of a manor, and the manor courts and how land was transferred. And this is where you get copyhold, and I mentioned that briefly earlier. And it's a form of ownership that's now gone out of practice. It was abolished in 1922. But prior to that, a lot of property, if it wasn't freehold, you often got copyhold, which was effectively a type of freehold, and it could be passed to another family member, or it could be passed in wills, but it still belonged to the manor. And when it changed hands, or when it was passed on, a fee or a heriot or something was owed to the lord of the manor at that transfer. And all those records were recorded in the manor court rolls, or the manor court book. The rolls were early records, and that's an image of one on the left there. And then there's a manor court book in the middle. And so if you've got a copyhold house, then you've got loads of, you trawl through the old manorial records, but it's brilliant because it's all there. So, and then equally in estate collections, they can have piles of deeds like this one on the right. It's literally piles of deeds attached to a property in Essex. And that some of it's perhaps not useful, but at the same time, in some cases, it can reveal the whole story of a house and the land and what was going on. So all sorts. And this is where you might, you know, if you're looking at the big picture of history, and, you know, if if you're looking at the enclosure and how that had an impact on the changes from the medieval or the Tudor into sort of more modern history and modern land ownership, then these records are also valuable for that, because it really gives you a picture of how the manor was responsible for property in a particular area, or how a large landed estate owned large swathes of agriculture and property, and then how that might have shifted over time, and perhaps 19th, 20th century it gets sold off, or it changes, or what goes on. So it opens up a wider picture. And as I said, that also looks at different types of ownership, and to copyhold, freehold, different things. And actually, yeah, it's really important to point out that actually up until the 20th century, most people did not own their own home. Before the First World War, it's estimated at about 10 or 12% of people were owner occupiers. So you had almost 90% of the country were renting, were leasing their land, and that's everything from sort of middle class Victorian towns through to the poorer. And obviously it depends on if you were fairly well off and you were living in a large home, then you had a yearly rental or yearly agreement. Obviously the poorer, they had monthly or weekly or even day or even a night. So just depending, and that also brings into question about, you know, rental and occupation and ownership of land. So that's another broad area. So we've looked at large areas of ownership and occupation of houses, but not forgetting that looking at the history of a house, also there are changes inside the home. So you can find building and drainage plans. These are plans for 1930s houses in Hampstead. And so really lovely plans. It gives you a detail of how things were laid out. But it's also an example of how house design changed. And this is obviously 1930s, but you've got the terraced house before that, what was going on before. And plans can be really useful for that. But also it opens up questions about how we've lived in our homes. Just as much as you had the houses in Soho in Kingly Street, yes, they were originally large single family homes, and then slowly over time they divided and divided and divided again, so you had families on every floor and different rooms. And so actually that breaks up questions about how did people live in their houses. When we see one single house, that doesn't necessarily mean it's just one family in there. So there's broader questions. But also things like, how did people cook in their homes? If, say, for example, those people living in Soho, they lived in one room, they might have had one fireplace. They might have been able to cook on that fireplace, but otherwise there was no kitchen, there was no facility for that. So often you get takeaways, or you go to the cookhouse, or you go to the, you know, there's lots of different bigger picture questions about how did people actually live? How did people light and heat their homes? Going from candles to gas to electricity, water. You've got all the questions about, okay, well, how did you have a bath? But then how did you go to the toilet? And actually most people had an outside loo. You only had flushing toilets from the 19th century. So there's all those bigger questions about how were actually people living in their homes, and what the bigger picture about what that meant. And it's actually only largely the 20th century that we've become so accustomed to electricity, to central heating. You know, there's all those sort of wider questions, but also looking at the terraced house in particular, and how we went from timber framed houses with jetties like you get in the Shambles in York or places like that. How do we go from that to sort of the brick terrace in the Georgian period? And actually it largely stems from the Great Fire of London. And so it's a big picture about, yes, there was this enormous impact on the Great Fire of London, and then you had things like the plague going on at the same time. But actually after the fire, because of most houses were timber framed, it brought in building acts that were implemented to prevent large fire again. So you initially, even from the 1690s, or even actually directly after the Great Fire, you had initial building acts that required a certain level of building. And then they were updated 1690s, early 18th century, until you get to about 1774, which is the Building Act, which sort of brought in all those things together. and it set out things like brick, room sizes depending on a different rate of house, and this is an example of a second-rate house, and it had sash windows, and you had differences between sash windows being set back or being forward, and what that meant for fire risk. And then depending on the width of the street, how tall could the house go? So there's all sorts of things that that come into play, and that essentially guided the design of the terraced house that predominated for hundreds of years. And actually, it was only largely the 20th century that we started to shift away from the traditional terraced house. The architecture might have shifted, and there were different changes on the exterior, but actually inside, a lot of the time, the houses were pretty similar, same kind of layout, same kind of design. So this again brings up questions about how did people live in their homes, and these are obviously two extremes. You've got the bottom right is Seven Dials in Covent Garden, which is actually a really lovely place now. You go down Seven Dials, but of course it was one of the worst slums near St Giles in the middle of London. And then on the left you've got Redcliffe Gardens, which is part of Kensington, much larger, multi-story, single-family homes with, you know, large living spaces, kitchens, and all sorts. And it just raises a lot of questions. How many servants did people have? What were going on with slum clearances? Then you get the shift in housing, and how did they alleviate the slum problem? And you get things like model dwellings, and you've got Peabody dwellings, and then you get garden cities, and then you get social housing. And then you've got the post-First World War homes for heroes. And so there's all sorts of questions about how did the house develop over time, and how we lived in those houses changed. This is one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite pictures. This is High Street, Kensington. Obviously, this is the flags. They're not sheets or laundry across, but they're flags across the street because it was the Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. But you've got people in their carriages going off to Hyde Park to parade and be seen, and then you've got the workman on his ladder on the right. So such a picture of life. I find it extraordinary. But that's the point with the history of houses, and it is about the people. It's the people stories. How I've just talked about how people lived, but if you're researching one house in one street, you'll get different stories. If you research the neighboring house, you'll get different stories. So actually, if you're giving your classroom, or perhaps you're doing a project where you look at houses in a village or a different street, actually you'll end up with different stories depending on the people involved. And this could be everything. You know, I've done a small little cottage in Norfolk, which ended up being owned by one of the few survivors of the charge of the Light Brigade. And this extraordinary story unraveled, and he'd actually written a diary of his time. He survived just, but he was very severely wounded. Ended up being nursed by Florence Nightingale, if you can believe it. But this whole story, it's just a little cottage in Norfolk. But this whole story of the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade, Florence Nightingale, it all opened up, and it was just this small little house. And equally, a house in North London, it ended up being occupied by a man called John Wilson. Seems like a very ordinary name. Turns out he was one of the early omnibus proprietors, and he was one of the first people to provide an omnibus route from the city into North London, and actually became very wealthy doing it. And so this whole picture about how transport and expansion started in London. And also you've got writers and artists and creatives and what that meant for their homes. And I've done a house in Hampstead, which was occupied by multiple artists, and the house is actually painted by these artists, and then they went off, and actually a lot of them became war artists in the First World War, and then 20 years later it was a different set of artists who were in the house, and they became a haven for people escaping Nazi Germany. So this extraordinary, again, you've got, perhaps you think artists, and that's interesting in and of itself, but then it brings up the bigger pictures of the First World War and how that was documented, and then the Second World War and how artists and creatives escaped from Nazi Germany. So all sorts of things can come out of a house based on who was there and what you're finding and who the people were. So it just, I find it extraordinary, and hopefully that's given you a bit of a glimpse about my work, the different sources, how they can be pieced together, and how they can sort of give a broader picture of a much wider history and wider historical subjects. And it's all through the avenue of a house. So that's me.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was absolutely jam-packed, and there were so many things. I was talking to John as you were going, and actually we were talking about loads of stuff we can use in our classrooms with immediacy. There's so many rich opportunities there for getting real sources into the classroom, which I think is something we're all kind of very keen to do as history teachers. Also as well, a personal thanks from me as a Gloucestershire lad. It was nice to see lots of stuff from Gloss in there. That was great. Possibly a bit left field, and I'd imagine the answer is often you are commissioned, but I was just thinking about how a teacher might use this and how we might go and do kind of research about a specific house. And how might you go about choosing which houses to research? Is there a knack to sort of knowing one that could potentially be interesting?
The short answer is, well, no. I think actually, yes, you're right in the sense that actually most of my work is commissioned, so I don't actually choose the house. But even thinking about it, you know, even in my local area, you know, if I think about, oh, it would be quite interesting to know the history of that house or that house, and perhaps it's just because it looks older than the ones around it, or perhaps it looks more unique, or it looks slightly odd in the context. But yeah, I think actually the principle of what I do is like the story of the little cottage in Norfolk. Actually, it, you know, the exterior can be deceptive, and actually you can have a very ordinary looking house but find amazing stories. And so actually I think that example of perhaps taking a street, or actually just picking, if kids just choose the history of their own house, or if they choose the history of their grandparents' house, or what, you know, actually you never know what stories you can find. Actually there are, you know, there are occasions where you don't find much, and perhaps it's you know, less exciting, there's nothing dramatic, but equally you can find something interesting in terms of the history and development, and how, you know, I did a house in parts of West London actually, and there wasn't amazing groundbreaking kind of stories, but it turns out that actually I found the original drainage plans, and the original name of the house was actually named after the daughter of the builder. And the current owners didn't know that. They didn't know why the house was named in this way, but actually it turns out it was the daughter of the builder. So that was, you know, a little snippet of history. But then also, you know, that it was affected by the development of the underground and how parts of London expanded. So then you get into the bigger question about the underground and the expansion of London. So you might not find something super exciting, but perhaps it'll bring up wider questions of history in an area. So.
And kind of again, but potentially difficult to answer, but you've given us a wealth of sources. If as a teacher we wanted to go and do some research about a house or a street, where would you start?
I would first start with maps, definitely. So as particularly at the moment with the archives closed, or, you know, got limitations on where you can go for sources. But actually, even despite that, if all the archives were open, I would still go to maps. I would still go to local history first. But maps is really a nice one because that's accessible to everyone, and it's a visual thing. I think when you're looking, if you're thinking about a classroom environment, and you can show the town or the street, if you can show the street and actually the street isn't there yet, and actually people go, oh my gosh, you know, like it was just all fields, or it was, you know, so that sort of thing can be really useful. So that's probably where I'd go first. A lot of the other sources are available through subscription sites, so things like the census, directories, electoral registers. Some you can find on sites that are free, but yeah, if there's a limit to accessibility, then maps is probably the first place easily to go. Yeah.
And you mentioned Lanes of London earlier, actually, which I've used being in a London school, and actually they've been into my school and worked with students last year, and it is
right.
They found my school currently is on a road called Wood Lane, and obviously it wasn't there when they were looking at the older maps, and they found that there was a wood there,
right.
which who explains to the schools. So yeah, I found that an incredibly useful resource. It's fantastic. So go out and check it out, especially if you're in a London school. And last very short question from me, and this is a plea. I thought that the source you mentioned about the census where the women had written on it something like they didn't count or something.
Yeah.
That just sounds amazing. And I think that would be such a powerful source to start a lesson with as a hook. Could you share that with us possibly?
Yes, I could. I'd have to go back through my files, but I've definitely got it somewhere. Yes.
That would be great. And
actually,
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say it's really interesting because it actually got me in touch with, because the women involved ended up, I think one of them was an actress, and she ended up in, I think it was literally like the Women's Actors League or something, who were really actively involved in the suffragette movement. And actually one of them ended up being arrested because she threw rocks at a private club in Pall Mall, and actually this whole thing unraveled through that one census record. So I'll dig it all out. Yeah.
That would be amazing. Those other resources would be fantastic as well. And what I'll do for everybody is when this goes up on YouTube, I'll create a Google Doc and attach the link to the description in YouTube so people can access it as well. And that would be fantastic. John, should we do questions from the Q&A?
Yeah, so there are 3 questions in the Q&A at the moment, and the first one is from Laura, and she asked, do you find tithe and enclosure maps, or is it a case of either or?
That's a great question. It can be both. You do often find that, if it's been enclosed, you don't get the tithe but actually, because they were 2 different things, the enclosure of land and the tithe were 2 different events. They were produced for 2 different things. But at the same time, it depends on the area. So it's a bit hit and miss. Sometimes you can find both. Sometimes you don't find either, because actually, depending on the history of that particular location, there were no lands to enclose, and actually the tithe had been much earlier, had already been sort of siphoned off and wasn't applicable in that area. So it's a bit of a mixed answer. But yeah, it depends on the area.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Laura, not sure if it's the same Laura or a different Laura, but she says, hi Mel, you mentioned workhouses. How would you go about researching the history of a workhouse?
I've never had to do that specifically, but I can send you, there's actually a man who's written several books, and he has an excellent website on workhouses, and just trying to think of his name off the top of my head. I can certainly find it, but actually there's bucket loads of information, and actually it's really helpful because he also gives the history not only of the workhouses themselves, but how the history changed from before the workhouses and the early poor rates and the early poor relief, and how that developed into workhouses and different attempts to alleviate the problem of the poor. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I will certainly find out and I'll send it on. So yeah.
That's really useful, thank you. It's also just really fascinating. And the final question is from Glenn Williams, who asks and says, I've recently come across 3 streets in the same area, built in the 1890s, which were all renamed in 1940. I understand individual houses might have been renamed due to the owner's preferences, but is there a common reason why whole streets would have been renamed?
It's a really good, I think the short answer is no. It's a really weird one. Except that one example I gave for Bedford Park, it changed from Hogarth Road to Priory Road, and actually it was just, obviously it was named Hogarth Road after the artist Hogarth, but for whatever reason they decided to call it Priory Road sort of 10-20 years later. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. Sometimes it is just municipal decisions. Sometimes it was a reorganization, so you often found the LCC, the London County Council Metropolitan Board of Works, they would often sort of reevaluate, especially in the Victorian period, and this is the same I think with different towns and cities and different locations, but things like Victoria Street or Victoria Road, and actually and by the late, I think actually there is a statistic somewhere that says actually by 1850 there was so many Victoria roads, because they were all obviously named after Queen Victoria, that there was so many that they had to sort of do some reorganization, because they had to find a way of deciphering and determining between the different ones. And that's the same with a few different common names or famous events. A lot of streets were named after famous events. If you've got you get street names all named after battles in the Crimean, and then all sorts of battles in the First World War, and then you get famous generals, and then you get landowners. So obviously if an area was developed by a landowner, then all the street names are attached to that. So a prime example is like the Grosvenor Estate in central London, and all, you know, Grosvenor Square and all those sorts of things. But all the surrounding streets are often all named after either family members or their estates in different parts of the country. So a lot of the times it's a bit of, you know, bit of a whim, but yeah, why they're renamed is often perhaps just to create a differentiation between other streets. That might have been the reason. So
no, thank you for that. That's really interesting. We've just had a couple more come through, and so Aidan has asked, where a house had a freeholder who leased it out to a farmer who used it to house his labourers, who is liable for paying the taxes like poor rate, window tax, hurt tax, etc.?
Yeah, in that case, it was probably the farmer. It depends on the setup, and quite often it was the person occupying the home. But in that scenario, you would have got, actually it would have been the farmer. So in some records I've got, even in places like Mayfair or towns and cities, larger houses, where actually there was a landowner, and then it was leased to a leaseholder, or it was a leaseholder in this context, but then it was sublet to different individuals. But actually in the rate books, it actually says John Smith 4 tenants, and actually the rate was paid by the leaseholder, not the occupants in that scenario. So yeah, in that scenario, it would have probably been the farmer. Yeah, if that helps.
Yeah, definitely. I think that answers that question. Final one that's in the Q&A at the moment is from Chris, and he says, all I know about my house is a rough build date of 1927 provided by the surveyor. How do I start to research? Where should I look first, please?
Okay, with that kind of house, you could be tempted to sort of jump back into the 1920s, and you might get away with that because it's a more recent build. But I would probably still do it if I was researching it. I would still do the backwards thing and start with more recent records. Perhaps look at a title register if it's on land registry, and that will give you a few key details about more recent time. Work back through electoral registers, directories. You've got the 1939 register as well, and then looking at different things. I did actually it was at 1929, 1930s houses, similar kind of scenario, and actually ended up, there were newspaper reports all about the development of the land, because it had previously been a golf course, and actually it was being covered in new housing, and half the housing was sort of social council housing, half was private development. But it was all recorded in the newspapers. It was all being reported about the development of the land. So again, if you're piecing together lots of different sources, you should be able to get to roughly when it starts appearing. So say, for example, rate books or the electoral registers. If you've got the house there in 1929, it's there in 1928, 1927, there's nothing there, then you can start to sort of assume that that's because the house wasn't complete yet and it wasn't being occupied. So roughly that will give you an idea. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you. And I think that's it from the Q&A. So I'll hand back to Sam now. And thank you for answering all those questions, Mel.
Okay.
Thanks, John. Just while we've been going through the Q&A, there's a wealth of things which people have written in the chat, which is really useful. Lots of people saying, I think that chap's called Peter Higginbotham, is that right?
Yes, thank you very much, yes.
And lots of people sharing various links and things to workhouses.org.uk, oneplacestudy.org. I think someone shared the link possibly to that suffragette source that we were talking about. which I think somebody's found on a Find My Past blog, which is great. If you could still share us with it,
Yeah,
with
yeah,
that'd be wicked.
definitely.
And I'll put it on the video, as I've said, for people who are watching the recording of this. But yeah, loads of great stuff on there. So thank you so much to everybody who's been sharing things as we've been talking, and do go and have a look at those, everybody, if you are interested. All that's really left for me to say is a really huge thank you, Mal. I thought tonight was absolutely fantastic, and such, as I mentioned, a wealth of sources, real sources for us to use in the classroom, which personally I find really exciting. So thank you so much. Really hope you enjoyed this recording. Before you go, please just do us one really quick favour and just click subscribe to our YouTube channel. We know it's a chore, but it's going to make such a huge difference to the network as we try to grow. Thank you.